Hello, welcome back to the podcast Journey to Well. So, honestly, listen, I say this every time, but it's because my guests are so incredible. But I am going to learn something new having this conversation with Melanie Weller, and that's very exciting to me. When we had a chat, you were one of my most favorite podcast connection calls that I've had in the past month or so. I'm just thrilled to have this conversation with you, Melanie. So we're going to be talking about, very basic. We'll just say we're going to talk about astrology, but it's definitely way layered than that and way cooler than just your basic astrology. So we'll dive into all of that. First of all, I would like to allow you to introduce yourself. That's one of my favorite things to do on this podcast, is see how my guests would like to be introduced and how they would introduce themselves. So there's nothing specific that you have to say, but who is Melanie? And thank you so much for coming on. I'm really excited for this conversation.
Oh, thank you, Hannah. I so appreciate this invitation and a chance to speak about this. What we're going to talk about today is really, for all of my clinical and scientific background, this is the piece of my work that really lights me up.
Mm.
And I came out of athletic training and physical therapy and have been doing vagus nerve work from long before it was cool, like it is on social media now. And over the years, I collected credentials and certifications like some people collect fine wines. It was part of my whole validating myself, and getting over my own not enoughness.
Yeah.
And as part of that, I got to I had amazing mentors and was really driven to seek more knowledge and more knowledge. And then one day my life fell apart, or I had a health crisis, marriage crisis, and lawsuit crisis, all in very close proximity. And my knowledge was not enough to make sense of what was happening in my life.
Wow.
And that's when I turned to astrology.
Hmm.
And it helped me make sense of all the nonsense that was happening in my life. And I had a big awareness at that time that the universe was driving me to do something different, because I had always been the highly credentialed physical therapist that in secret had this really special set of soft skills that people really came for, but you had to have the secret code to come find me.
We didn't talk about it.
We didn't talk about that, right? And and in the midst of that, that crisis, I really came upon this realization of how our anatomy and even our molecules are made in the image of the Zodiac. Like, just quite literally hardcore geometry, as above, so below. And in the throes of all of that, to top it all off, I had a patient walk into my office that had a suicide plan for that evening. And he was living in a nightmare of a hallucination that he couldn't get out of, and wasn't responding to other things that he had done. And I knew I had to bring more than just my clinical self to the table with him that day. And I showed up with all of my clinical knowledge, all of my esoteric knowledge, and all of my intuition. And 90 minutes later, he was 90% better. And I walked out with my fearless presence that day, and I say we really saved each other. And it's so fun. I actually just saw him at a parade, a Mardi Gras parade in the French Quarter the other night, and so it's so fun to give him a big hug and just see how much he's thriving right now. And but since then, I've really been passionate about helping people bring together their intuition and their expertise, and bringing together, uniting ancient and modern science, because culturally we tend to put them at odds with each other. And I will tell you, because I've been living in both of these worlds for 30 years, that when you put them together, you can make miracles happen every single day.
Yeah, absolutely. I love that. And that was one of the things that I appreciated hearing so much from you, is that I come from a really big science background in human design. If we're talking in terms of human design, I have a one line, which is the investigator, and we're very data driven. And if somebody says something, I'm like, okay, but where was like the research that you found? You concluded that answer. And I'm very interested in the science and psychology and sociology. And then we get into astrology. And I was also raised by a mom that is very spiritual. And so I feel like I kind of was raised in that. Like they don't have to be two separate things. However, in the world, Eastern, Western philosophy are very different and always kept very separately. And it's so interesting. It's so interesting to even have the idea that our anatomy mimics the zodiac sign, which I definitely do want to get into. But I also, oh, shoot, I already forgot my question. Let's get into it. I had something else that I wanted to ask
Well,
before, but now it's
yeah.
like,
So I'll just maybe what
sure.
we'll start with is just the overarching, to me, where the science and the um, astrology really intersect is in time. Because even if you don't believe in astrology, the zodiac is a clock.
Mm-hmm.
The sun and the moon, like we know that the planets move through these signs and the zodiac, the constellations encircle the earth like a great clock.
Mm-hmm.
And the research now shows that for basically every mental health diagnosis that a lot of neurological diagnoses and sports like orthopedic type injuries, that time perception and processing are at the root of them.
Mm-hmm.
And when you can get the brain really organized in time, a lot of things fall into place. And the things that you would do for that are not, like in my world, are not necessarily always that different than what you would do for trauma informed care.
Okay.
But but we will never sell trauma informed care to the whole world because not everybody wants to deal with their trauma, or to think, or like, and I think there's a lot of limitations in looking at life only through the lens of trauma.
Mm.
Because I see a lot of people that get really caught up in like, oh, is the fact that when I slouch in my chair that I go to the left, is that a trauma response? And like, well, like, does it really matter? Like, I don't know.
Yeah,
Like, there's like, I think, I see a lot of people that get really caught up in the minutia and I see it online and I
sure.
see comments like, so what you're telling me is that every crumb of my existence is a trauma response. And I think that's not a joyful way to move through life. I don't think you have to move.
Sure.
I think that we are incredibly resilient, pleasure seeking beings. And that's
Mm.
also, the trauma lens is a very Western lens. An Eastern lens would say that we are pleasure seeking.
Mm.
And they can be kind of avoiding trauma and seeking pleasure, kind of two sides of the same coin.
Sure.
But it certainly affects, uh, to walk through life wondering like where the next trauma is coming from
Yeah.
versus where is the next pleasurable thing coming from
Mm.
are two very different ways to walk through your life.
Yeah.
So I am a big advocate for what I'm calling time informed care over trauma informed
Mm.
care. And because we all would like to maybe have a different relationship with time, like maybe more playtime, more downtime, more me time, more vacation time, more family time. You can walk through the houses of the zodiac chart and, for all the different types of time that you might
Mm-hmm.
want. And so you can apply then somatic exercises very specifically and therapeutically to help you get the kind of time that you want.
Hmm. So you're saying ultimately instead of like, let's say back issues, because that's just very
Mhm.
relevant to everyone, but also to me. So back issues, instead of maybe looking at it for like, what is the trauma that I underwent, whether that's emotional, physical, spiritual, how would we reframe that to a time response?
Right. So if you're going to look at, for example, Sagittarius ruling the hips,
Mm-hmm.
that you, that maybe there's a little bit more truth time that you need in
Mm.
your body or more fitness time. I mean, that really could just be an exercise
Yeah.
thing, and exercise is great for low backs.
Mm-hmm.
That like, I mean, that can just be, I mean, that matches the science really beautifully. And that's what, what Sagittarius embodies. Now, if you're going to, if I think about it with the spine, if you're going to think about your spine as Leo and your pelvis as Sagittarius, that
Mm-hmm.
then there's like, okay, like what's happening with your fire energy? Like, is everything
Yeah.
on fire? Is it too hot? Do you need to be a little bit cooler? Like, where's the balance in that? But really, it's just like, how, like, are they fighting each other? Or are they sitting in right relationship? Because it's not always about the it's easy if we like stories to go with our things, and what are we caught up in stories, but very
Yeah.
honestly, we just have to take things out of get our bodies are our biggest collaborators. But
Yeah.
sometimes we live in a very competitive society, and sometimes that our spine starts competing with our pelvis, or these body parts are competing for our attention.
Mm.
And when you can get them, and pain is very much to me like a toddler or a puppy that just wants a little bit of attention, and then it'll go off and play on its own.
Yeah.
And so I think that when, and there's way I understood, there's way more scientific explanations for it, but it can be way easier than you might think. And
Yeah.
your pelvis is, it's shaped very much like a crossbow, like your spine, like your sacrum is sort of like an arrow. So you can really think of it in Sagittarius terms like a bow and arrow, the
Mm.
archer that goes with it. And so what is the energy of like, how is that crossbow sitting in your pelvis? Like, is it lined up that way? And even your thighs, the way your inner thigh muscles um, are on your femur, it's kind of like a Robin Hood bow. I don't know what you call that kind of bow, but
Mm-hmm.
archery bow and arrow
Yeah.
in that way. And, so there's like that energy of the arrow that can really get distorted. And I can go through all the osteopathic things to, uh, and manual therapy things to align the pelvis and all that kind of stuff. But I
Yeah.
have found that I get better, faster results when I tap into what people's Sagittarius bows and arrows are looking like, and get that
Wow.
organized in their bodies. And I get the same range of motion increases.
Mm.
Like, I can measure the outcomes objectively. And so I really love working with this energy medicine paradigm that I've created
Yeah.
with it. And uh, it's endlessly delightful to leave people with so much joy, and so much relief in their
Yeah.
lives when they thought it was going to be really hard to get better. And it's even I get a great deal of pleasure too, which is probably a little bit twisted, but when people get really angry, like they get better, like they sit up and they're looking for their pain, like it should be like it should be somewhere in the room, and they can't figure out where it is.
Yeah.
And then they're angry because it was so easy to get better.
Mm.
And I get it, like when you've really, like, because I don't see people that where it's usually their first rodeo trying to get
Right.
better. I get people when they've failed multiple other interventions. And, and they are rightfully angry when I touch them with very gentle force, or give them a few breathing, eye exercises, or tell them to do something, like move your toes like this. And then they're like, what happened? What just happened? Like,
Yeah.
why was it that
Yeah.
easy to get better?
Yeah. I can imagine. My mom also does energy work and saying, similar expectations and uh, outcomes of her working on me. And it's not a lot of touching, it's not a lot of moving, it's not we do overcomplicate, I think, in a lot of in healing, in the stories that we tell ourselves, in trauma work, I mean, in everything. I know that I do. I know that I
Oh, I think we all,
overcomplicate.
yeah, no, I think it's very much human nature to make it complicated. And it's, I think there can be value in that, or in creating, connecting, creating, understanding sometimes a story so that you can pattern
Yep.
that. But over the years and years, like when I would even tell people that like their vertebra was sheared in their spine, or that their uh, maybe their knee joint was sheared or something was misaligned. They're like, well, what does that mean? So it just means that we need to
Mm-hmm.
fix it. Like that's all it just means that it needs to go back in line. That's it. Like,
Yeah.
but I don't think we always have to make it that complicated. I think where it can sometimes be more valuable to make it a little more complicated is with autoimmune disorders and
Mm-hmm.
complex trauma, because there are some very deeply ingrained patterns there that can uh, that can be helpful to break. Like, are you stuck being the hero in someone else's story at the expense of your own? Or are you stuck satisfying
Mm.
everybody else's desires at the expense of your own? Or, that would be like Aries and Taurus kind of questions. Or
Okay.
what does justice mean for you? Like um, in the way, and maybe this is a good point to transition into how the anatomy lives in the body.
Mm-hmm.
Because, for example, Libra is Libra sign is scales, and scales are justice, just
Mm-hmm.
as they are even naturally in Libra in the seventh house in astrology. And the populations with the highest levels of social injustice have the highest levels of kidney disease. And your kidneys sit in your low back, just like a set of scales. And so we embody the stress of or of injustice at any level, at the level of the kidneys. And I think really, even separately from social justice, understanding what justice in our personal lives means for us, that, maybe it means that you get to paint for 2 hours a day. Maybe it means that you uh, get to have your favorite ice cream once a week, or like whatever that, it could mean anything, but really kind of identifying what that personal sense of justice is to give you the foundation, because people uh, often compromise themselves in that way without realizing how much compromising they're doing.
Yeah. Yeah, so when you're talking about like, oh, maybe this is you just said compromising my values and putting others first, that might be like an Aries Taurus thing. To be clear, are you saying like that's where we should be looking if that's our sun sign, if we're an Aries or a Taurus sun sign, or are we talking about the anatomy?
Well, I think when the anatomy is distorted in that part of the body, like if you're having neck pain, headaches,
Yeah,
dizziness, things like that, those are questions. That's when I would really look at those issues more than if it's your sun sign.
cool. Yeah.
Because in astrology, Aries rules the head and Taurus rules the throat. And so, for example, your vagus nerve can get compressed, get pinched at the base of your skull between your Aries and your Taurus. And this really works. I have a whole workbook I wrote on this, that your vagus nerve gets pinched between the signs as it
Mm.
moves through your body.
Mm-hmm. Which is fascinating to me, and I was trying to explain it to my mom and failed. So can you elaborate on that? What is, well, let's back up actually, because I know what you're talking about and you know what you're talking about, but can we, you just gave us the first two. Can we
Mm-hmm.
go through the zodiac signs
Sure.
where it shows up in anatomy, and then we
Yeah.
can talk about the vagus nerve?
Yeah. So there's So I'm going to go through where it shows up anatomically, but I'll say that there are other angles in the cosmos that show up in our bodies as well. Like the angle, there's 47 degrees between the pole stars that the Earth orients towards over thousands of years. And there's normal rotation in your upper neck is 47 degrees.
Ah.
The normal average angle of inclination of your anterior cruciate ligament in your knee is 47 degrees. uh, your vagus nerve exits the base of your skull at the same angle as the axial tilt of the earth
Hmm.
relative to the center of the spinal cord. And so and I could rattle anyway. So there's this whole system of critical angles too, or what I call
Sure.
critical angles in the body and, but with the anatomy, the ventricles of the brain are the same shape as the ram's horns that represent Aries. And in
Hmm.
astrology, Aries rules the head. Your throat anatomy is the same as the Taurus bull, your hyoid bone in your throat. It's like the horns
Yep.
of the bull. Your uh, collarbones and diaphragm, or like Gemini rules lungs and arms. So like your twin, the two sticks, but your collarbones and your diaphragm are like the top and the bottom of that Gemini symbol, like the Roman numeral
Yeah.
2. The Cancer rules the breasts, and the symbol for glyph for Cancer looks very much like a set of breasts.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Cancer also rules the stomach. So I think of your breasts as like the full moon and stomach is like the crescent moon.
Yeah.
The Leo rules the heart, and your aortic arch is the same shape as the symbol for Leo.
Mm.
Um, Libra or Virgo rules the digestive system, and
Mm.
your particularly your large intestines. But the way you can really make that Virgo symbol out of the macro anatomy, as well as if you think about Virgo being a goddess, the omentum, the covering
Mm.
of the intestines in the abdomen looks like a goddess's dress. It's tiered,
Mm-hmm.
like a lot of those old representations of a goddess would be. The Libra ruling the kidneys, we
Mm-hmm.
talked about. Scorpio rules the reproductive system, and a woman's reproductive system looks very much like a scorpion, where the ovaries are the claws and the vagina is the tail
Mm-hmm.
of the scorpion. Scorpio is also the traditionally the only sign that has 3 archetypes with it. So it also has a snake, which is like a male phallus,
Mm.
and a phoenix. And whether we're making love or babies or business or art, whatever way we make something from nothing, that comes from our reproductive area, from our second chakra. That's where we create from,
Yeah.
whatever it is, across many traditions.
Mm.
Um, Sagittarius rules the hips. We talked a little bit about that
Mm-hmm.
earlier as well with the bow and arrow. Capricorn rules the bones, and long bones are organized in little Saturnian circles,
Mm.
quite literally at the cellular level.
Yeah.
And the way the vasculature runs through the bones looks very much like that little H like symbol that represents Saturn.
Huh.
And Saturn is goat or goatfish. And this is going to take a little bit of imagination in podcast form. But
Yeah.
if you think about your kneecap as the nose of the goat, and your patellar tendon, the tendon below it, as the beard of the goat,
Mm-hmm.
and then your muscles as your muscles go up your thigh, they're kind of like the horns of the goat.
Mm.
You can really kind of make a goat out of it. And even if you could
Mm.
make a whole goat fish, if you're going to include the calf and your feet,
Mm-hmm.
as to be like the representations of Capricorn that are like I guess, mergoat,
Yeah.
for lack of a better term.
Yeah.
Um, Aquarius rules the calves,
Mm.
and your calves are shaped like the water vessel that the Aquarian water bearer holds.
Mm-hmm.
And the um, zigzag sign for Aquarius is really aligns with the multipennate muscle fiber structure of your calf muscles. Like
Mm.
that's how they're. It's a zigzag. They're very much organized like feathers, but if you look up an anatomical representation of multipennate muscle fibers, you can just follow the zigzag
Wow.
in the same way. And then Pisces rules the feet, and your feet are your fish, your flippers.
Your flippers. Very cool. Yeah. Well, thank you. I think that was really helpful to just go through all of them and kind of see where they all land in the body.
Yeah. Well, and
Um,
the one thing I'll say also about the body that, because especially as breath work is really popular right now,
mhm.
and really valuable, is that, astrologers I've talked to over the years say that, like, well, your whole body is Earth, because like Earth isn't represented specifically in the body, and they'll say like, oh, it's just your whole body.
Yeah.
But I really think of our diaphragms like our personal Earth, because
Hmm.
if we're not breathing, we're not earthbound,
Yeah.
and our hearts literally sit on top of our diaphragm. Like your heart is even attached to your diaphragm.
Mm.
and it sits on it just like the sun sits on the horizon at a sunrise or a
Mm.
sunset.
Wow.
And if your diaphragm function isn't right, like you don't have, when diaphragms get dysfunctional, they tend to get flat. They
Hmm.
lose the dome shape. And when you lose that nice round horizon line, it can create lots of problems. So I'll throw earth in there. And I think it is really, our relationship with earth is very much in our diaphragms.
Yeah, I like that. I think that's a really cool analogy too, because breath work can be very grounding for people and
Absolutely.
literally
Absolutely. And it's great
working.
on so many levels. The other thing that happens when diaphragms are dysfunctional, and I can go into this with other parts of the body too, but it can literally pinch your vagus nerve as it's going because it has to cross through your diaphragm.
Hmm.
And in all humans, the right side of the diaphragm has more muscle mass than the left. So theoretically, the right side will always win. So that's why you see a lot of people with low right shoulders in their
Interesting.
posture, for example. And so taking people out of that right diaphragm dominance can be really helpful
Hmm.
in terms of, uh, I will say, especially like right shoulder, right hip pain, but even hiatal hernia issues that might, which will show up more on this, which is really more of a vagus nerve compression issue as
Hmm.
it's because it follows your esophagus, but to take the pull off of where your esophagus and vagus nerve are going through your diaphragm can make a really huge difference for things like that. But it can also get compressed through your vagus nerve, which mediates a lot of your feel good sensations. Like I think of like grace under pressure and calm and sexual
Hmm.
function. And it's a huge nerve. It goes all the way from the brainstem to the pelvis, but it can also get compressed generally wherever you have horizontal structures.
Right.
So base of the skull, vocal cords, collarbone, like thoracic inlet level, um, pulmonary artery and vein, where they go horizontal through at the heart,
Hmm.
diaphragm, renal artery vein, pelvic floor are the big ones.
Hmm. And why does this happen at these horizontal structures?
Well, we embody stress and trauma more on the transverse plane, like on the horizontal, than we do on other planes.
Hmm.
And if you just think about what happens, like if you're going to walk joyfully, or if you're going to think of um, being a glamorous runway model and walking down the runway, you're going to have some really nice swagger, some nice arm swing. When we get stressed and traumatized, the first thing we do is bring our arms in close and stop rotating.
Yeah.
So the transverse plane, that rotation is the first thing we give up. And clinically, for at least in my profession, it's often the last thing we're told to give people back because it's quote unquote the most dangerous when it comes to herniated discs and
Yeah.
things like that. Or you have to really be cautious. And not that any of that is untrue, but I think that uh, I am much more intentional about restoring rotation earlier than um, than I was trained originally
Okay.
to be. Because as you free up, as you get the rotation, so everything else follows.
Yeah.
Even if they can't, for people that like a herniated disc is a good example. Like the people have to stay in their pain-free range of motion. It doesn't mean that they can always use their full range of motion as they're rehabilitating, but to be able to have the option to move into it and
Yeah.
to then teach their bodies that, oh, it's not threatening to do this,
Hmm.
rather than waiting, saying like, oh, no, no, you're not allowed to rotate and keep them out of fear of rotation because that's just not real life. People don't do that.
Yeah. Yeah. That's hard when we're in pain to want to move in ways that maybe are uh, can be more painful or can cause pain
Absolutely. Yeah. And we
or
have our
fear.
movement is so wired in at the lower levels of our brain. Like it's so brainstem and cerebellar mediated. We're not always thinking about it and to have to,
Yeah.
if you have a baby, for example, or a toddler, it can be really hard to be hypervigilant about your movement. And I don't know that we really serve people that well by telling them they have to be hypervigilant about their
Yeah.
movement all the time. If you can, especially if you can give them the freedom where they don't have to do that so much.
Mm. Mm. So yeah, let's talk about strengthening these horizontal. The diaphragm's interesting to me because I have a background in speech pathology and breath work, so I deal a lot with the diaphragm. I've never heard that your diaphragm on the right side is a little bit stronger, which also kind of makes sense to me. I'm connecting it to the right side of our body as our masculine side, so maybe just over flexing that side is what I'm connecting to. But you said something about like strengthening, stretching, helping that. How do we do those things on the horizontal planes?
Yeah. So my favorite way to kind of start to normalize that is to do what I call helical breathing.
Okay.
And so if people want to participate, please do. I'll guide everybody through this. But um, please do not multitask while you're doing this. Don't do it while you're driving. Don't do it while you're chopping vegetables in your kitchen. Um, I have had some terrible kitchen accidents because when my nervous system was dysregulated. So I'm very like,
Yeah.
just, like be very, I'm not just asking everybody to be uh, focused while you do this. But if you're sitting, like sit on the edge of the chair so you're up in uh, at least a decent posture. Cross your left ankle in front of your right. And you're going to take your right hand and reach it across your body. If you can, get it all the way on the outside of your left thigh or as far across your body as you can. And if you have any limitations that keep you from doing this, just imagine doing it in your head. Your brain really doesn't see imagining doing it and actually doing it is any different. And you're going to take your left hand and put it behind your head. So you've got left ankle in front of right hand across, right arm across body, left hand behind head. And then inhale into the back side of your heart. And I know that's a weird thing. If you have somebody at home, it can be nice to have them put their hand between your shoulder blades just so you have a little cue. But try to expand your rib cage to the wall or whatever's behind you. And then hold it for a couple seconds. I usually have people maybe inhale for 3, hold for 6, and then exhale for 9, something like that. And you can do that several times. But this is a nice way. This decompresses your vagus nerve at multiple levels, but especially at the diaphragm because it takes you're rotating your arm is across to the left, so you're getting out of that right-sided diaphragm dominance. And just like usually 3 to 5 of these is enough to start to ease it up. And if you're, uh, I didn't take everybody through this part, but before and after, do a little body check, like check your head rotation or your trunk rotation or, do a squat or just see how it feels before and after.
Mm-hmm.
Because you could check your balance. I get really good visual improvements from all of these. I can read without my glasses more clearly when I do
Wow.
things like this.
Yeah.
But um, but that's a nice, uh, I always say, I think this is a great exercise for like when you helped a friend move furniture and you think, oh, I'm going to pay for that tomorrow. It helps you keep from having to pay for it.
Nice. That is very cool. That's awesome. So what about, I mean, we don't have to go through all of them, but can we look at the pelvic floor is the last place you said that the vagus nerve
Yes. Yeah.
extends to. So
Yeah.
again, I'm kind of thinking back pain. Honestly, it's a big part of my situation right now, but I feel like we have like a back pain pandemic. Like everyone, I feel like has lower
Hmm.
back issues, and the more that I dive into it, the more I'm like, we shouldn't have this. We shouldn't. And I think a big part of it is movement. And I agree. I think that we spend a lot of time sitting at desks and driving, and we're just not moving enough as humans, as bodies. Um, but I assume that you have something to
I
add.
agree. Yes. Well, I will say the exercise we just did can be really powerful even for low back issues
Cool.
because our pec majors, and our chests, our serratus muscles that are on the front side of our shoulder blades, our lat muscles that make up the back wall of our armpits and go down into our
Mm.
low back, our hip hikers, or quadratus lumborum, and hip flexors, psoas muscles, all attached to the diaphragm. It makes like a star in the center of your body.
Ah.
And if you have tight hip flexors that are causing back pain, I guarantee that your diaphragm is not in the right position. I have not had to treat a tight hip flexor in decades, probably, because when you get the diaphragm in the right place, the hip flexor just goes, thank you, and
Wow.
relaxes. So there's, uh, so the exercise we just did can be really, really powerful for back pain as
Mm.
well. But one of the big things your vagus nerve is a part of sensory wise is your interoceptive system. And it's like that map of what's happening or that feeling of what's happening inside of your body.
Okay.
And we're not very aware of that collectively. Like we
Mm.
don't have really good maps in our brains or like, and when part of your body gets fuzzy in your brain is going to perceive that as a threat and lock it
Mm.
down somehow. So one of my favorite exercises uh, that's also probably the easiest of them to explain in this format for for
The
the
YouTube
pelvic
video,
floor.
maybe if you watch the video, you can see
Yeah,
us like moving our hands.
moving around.
Maybe that will be easier.
But your pelvic floor is basically like a or like a trampoline, if you want to
Hmm.
imagine it like that, the way that it sits in the bones. And so if you imagine that there's a little version of yourself inside of you, and that when you inhale, you're going to land on that trampoline, and when you exhale, you're going to jump up.
Hmm.
And just to kind of get the hang of that to start, and then to divide your pelvic floor into quadrants and try and jump on the right front quadrant. Like, can you land on just over there? And can you land on the right rear quadrant and the left rear quadrant and the left front quadrant? And I will tell you, when I first did this for myself, I had no right side of my pelvic floor. It just didn't exist.
Wow.
So don't be freaked out if you can't find that,
Yeah.
but just keep practicing. Just keep trying to move, see if you can build that, go like, oh, where is my pelvic floor? Like it's a little discovery mission,
Yeah.
and that, but, and you will eventually find it.
Hmm.
I'm not a huge fan of people doing Kegels because most of the time they do them wrong.
Hmm.
And it's not really, I think it ends up being counterproductive in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
But to have a little bit of sense of like, just even in your mind's eye, what it doesn't even have to be accurate. Like, or if you're going to, imagine what your crossbow in your pelvis looks like, that,
Mm.
you know, or even to take like uh, I, so like in Vedic astrology, the Hindu deity Ganesh goes with your brainstem and cerebellum because your cerebellum is like the ears of Ganesh and your brainstem's like the trunk. So it's like, looks like an elephant.
Hmm.
And your pelvis mirrors some of that,
Mm.
like where uh, your pelvic bones are very much like elephant ears. And if you think of your sacrum coming in being kind of like the face, nose of like your coccyx is the trunk,
Yeah.
the elephant in a different way, that like, what's happening with your elephant? Just use like, like look, get a picture of anatomy and just decide what it means to you. Maybe it looks like a butterfly. What's happening with your butterfly?
Mm.
And what does it need? And really just using those imaginal exercises are incredibly powerful at repatterning pain and voice and even finding the solutions. I worked with somebody recently, and she actually came to me because she was having recurring urinary tract infections.
Mm.
And uh and she had nearly died of a pulmonary embolism about a year ago. And she's a singer, not professionally, but like sings in church, and like that's always been a big part of her life. And her throat was really where her restriction was. And there's research around this that if you can't move your voice through a full range, or let me say this the other way, people that have pelvic floor incontinence issues, especially, like leaky bladder
Mm-hmm.
type issues, are often cannot move their voice through a full range. They keep their voice in a very narrow range. And what happens is that your vocal cords can literally act like a lid on the rest of your system, putting extra downward pressure. So sometimes, often in a practice, these are, but not always, these are either moms of young kids or grandmothers.
Mm-hmm.
And having them like read Little Red Riding Hood and doing all the voices. So they're doing Little Red Riding Hood and the Big Bad Wolf, and you're getting all the, the full vocal range
Yeah.
is part of the homework. But with this woman, we, I had her come up with her own, as we worked through the imagery and the energy and all of it, I said, what song is going to heal it? And she knew exactly what song and started singing it. And it was just this really beautiful, magical moment
Wow.
that, had some really beautiful, lasting, like really helped her get over the hump of, or like get out of the cycle of recurring
Wow.
um, problems. And so our, and to me, this is kind of the best use of Eastern and Western medicine together, because you're harnessing the really the superhighway of the brain. Like our logic circuits are so much slower. Like our logic and verbal circuits work at something like 40 bits per second in our brain, and our um, imagination, imagery, kind of circuits work at like 11 million bits per second.
Hmm.
And so when we can get on these superhighway pathways in very, I would say prescriptive ways,
Yeah.
you can really like like magical things can happen, and it's really pulling the best of both worlds together.
Mm.
To me,
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah, this is fascinating to me, and I love these perspectives of being able to pull, because even just I would imagine people listening, because it's a fairly new concept to me, but even just hearing what your pelvic floor has to do with your vocal cords, or somehow they're connected, where anatomically they're almost at two opposite ends of our body. So how could those possibly be connected? Or even, you talking about our hip flexor muscle, the front of your hip flexor being connected to your diaphragm, which is within your rib cage. I mean, that's wild. For I didn't even know that until I went through this back injury, and I my chiropractor would do hip flexor work, and he would go so far, like right up, basically like right up to my rib cage, like the middle part of my rib cage, and it would hurt, like everything that he was doing. And I was like, I didn't even know your hip flexor went that high. Like so many things that we're not taught in school. We don't have conversations about. We don't really have these conversations of connecting astrology to our anatomy. I mean,
Oh,
like this is
well, we
so
we
many.
even learn anatomy in very siloed ways, and
Yeah.
like it's all mushed together and vacuum sealed inside of us together. Like it
Hmm.
does not work separately, even though, and we may, like, no matter what you're always, I mean, I think of it like I'm always treating the whole system,
Yeah.
no matter what I'm doing, because I know, um, like when somebody, like biomechanically, if their big toe isn't moving right, like I have a biomechanical test for
Hmm.
that. In especially like in the absence of big toe pathology, that they haven't come to me because an elephant stepped on their foot, or,
Yeah.
something like that. That, you know, that I know that their vagus nerve is compressed at the base of their skull. And if I decompress the vagus nerve at the base of the skull, then the toe starts moving properly.
Wild.
And it is wild. And, I really learned a lot of this. Like, one, I just had amazing mentors, but when you get people that have, I ended up just very early in my career working with chronic pain patients that had not responded to other interventions, and they didn't need me to do the same thing that six other people had done with them.
Right. Right.
And so, that's where I really put together that, knee pain needed thoracolumbar junction stability, and that,
Mm.
that like these different pieces, or I needed to at least look at where the nerve root was for the part of the body that I was
Mm-hmm.
treating, and just to think, to keep thinking further up the chain, and what's the coordination, and like what's the vascular component to this, and what's the neural component to this, and you know what is pulling on what. I mean, even before I got into this whole astrology piece of it with my shoulder patients, I would always make sure they had enough ankle flexion, because they would get more shoulder motion if I corrected their ankle flexion
Wow.
limitations. And that it was just part of having a fully working system, that these things,
Yeah.
and that's something I learned in PT school, really, and so just being able to think systemically. But and it's been really disappointing to me over the, as I, especially now, like that I'm 30 years out of PT school, that what I learned back then still isn't standard practice, or still isn't standard education.
Hmm.
I had I'm so grateful every single day. And when I go to my professional conference and see my professors from back then, I tell them I think about them every single day. I'm so grateful, because I just had these amazing, um, like I really got what they were teaching me, that my
Yeah.
orthopedic patients were uh, had neurological coordination issues, which is why they got injured in the first place, and that
Yeah.
my neurological patients had orthopedic issues, and that they needed to have the right amount of ankle and hip motion to be able to stand up, after their strokes, and not evoke all sorts of muscle tone that was going to get in their way,
Hmm.
to have the most amount of smooth movement possible for themselves. And so, um, I've been really, really fortunate to be able to, just to have started in a very integrated place with that. But but yeah, medically, like, I mean, even when you go to the orthopedist, you see a different specialist for your ankle that you do for your knee. Like, they're not connected
Right.
to each other.
Right. You
And
have to go to all these different
all
doctors.
the different doctors. And, part of that is really because of the surgical techniques
Yep.
that they're specializing in. But it's really, like, we need a paradigm shift, because modern medicine, like, if we look at the statistics, like, especially the chronic pain, addiction,
Mm.
um, mental health, loneliness statistics, we are not getting better.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think our deepest grief, when I think about Gemini and the story of the Gemini twins, that it's really a story of grief. And in Chinese medicine, the lungs hold grief. And in the story of the Gemini twins, one is mortal and one is immortal. And when the mortal one dies, the immortal one asks Zeus either to put them in the stars to be together, or to give half of his immortality to his brother, so
Mm.
that they can be together. And I think our deepest grief is for our mortal relationship with our immortal self.
Wow.
And I think that astrology is a really good portal to knowing your soul and all the different systems. I mean, I've done traditional Western astrology and Vedic astrology and human design and
Mm.
gene keys, and they all give me something, like another piece of the puzzle. Like, they don't compete with it, and they really have helped me be fully expressed.
Wow. Hmm. That's really beautiful. Thank you. I'm trying to soak it all in. I mean, yeah, that was way more eloquent than how I explain why I got into human design, but that's what it is. It's all of these tools are ways to understand ourselves at a deeper level and accept ourselves at a deeper level. And I think when we're able to process that, we do witness ourselves authentically, and we're able to show up authentically, and that is the greatest gift that we
Oh,
can
absolutely.
give
Absolutely. I
ourselves.
think we're always uncovering that nothing was ever wrong with us to start.
Ugh, ugh, yeah,
Like, nothing is wrong with
absolutely.
you. and
Yeah.
we
Because we're
spend a lot of time, yeah,
thinking.
thinking that something is,
Yep.
and we certainly have challenges. Like, I mean, we all go through phases, cycles of illness and cycles of loss and cycles of abundance and cycles of
Yep.
hardships. And certainly, like, some astrological signatures are hard. Like, I get
Yep.
it. Like, we all have some of them. But I also think that it's easier to live in the shadow expression or in the lower
Mm,
octaves of it.
yeah.
Then the world doesn't invite us into those higher octaves of
Mm-hmm.
it as much.
Mm-hmm. Which really just loops this entire conversation to the beginning when we were talking about coming from a trauma perspective or a time and a pleasure perspective of how can I create more pleasure? How can I create more enjoyment in my life and create that time for that? I mean, that's just like a
Yeah.
perfect
Yeah.
loop.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, your body is a clock. We live inside the clock. You're moving through time and time is moving through you. And
Hmm.
when we get illness, I think sometimes time gets stuck
Mm-hmm.
in us. My client I told the story about with suicide ideation, like, he was living in rigor mortis. Quite,
Yeah.
I can objectively make that case from his range of motion measurements that,
Wow.
and so his body was telling his brain it was dead. So he was just trying to match that on the outside. But when you can, and there's amazing research about how our nervous systems connect to the solar system,
Mm.
even through our vagus nerves. So, like, this is a legitimate uh, thing. The extent to which the solar and space weather is disruptive depends on our the strength of our interpersonal connections. So the lonelier we are, the more disruptive it is, and we know we have a loneliness epidemic.
Yeah.
And even in the ratios of solar weather to geomagnetic activity to solar ray activity, um, are predictive of specific causes of death. Like, when they look retrospectively over causes of death, there are specific patterns that go with when people died of heart attacks versus strokes versus accidents versus car accidents versus
Huh.
cancer versus suicide.
Interesting.
So the great mother brought you in and the great mother takes you out.
Amen.
But I
I
think that if
believe
you
it.
can, if you can move the solar system through your nervous system, it will not short circuit into a heart attack or stroke, or not as early as it would otherwise.
Interesting. Oh my gosh, I feel like we have so much we could talk about.
I know I could talk to
I
you all
have
day, Hannah.
I have one more question, but before then, where can people find you? What are you doing now? Are you working mostly one-on-one? Do you have a group container? Where can people find you,
I'm
learn more?
I am launching a group. I have lots of options. They're all at my website, which is my name, melanieweller.com.
Okay.
The I am getting ready in April 2025 to launch I'm calling it heretical healing, like, to teach all of this so that I pass it on. I know part of my part of my astrology says that I hoard occult information, and so I am working to not. I am unhoarding all of my information that I've been collecting over the years,
Love it.
and I deal a lot. I do a little bit of one-on-one work. I also host at the beginning of each month a free event called Rewiring Religion, because I deal with a lot of religious trauma, which
Mm-hmm.
also connects to authoritarian and institutional trauma. Like, they're different. It's kind of a different animal at the level, like, really, in the brain science than, um, I'll say, quote unquote, ordinary trauma. But
Mm-hmm.
it has unique neural signatures that some other forms of trauma do not have.
Okay.
And so we uh, talk about that and how to heal it, and that's completely free. Um, and I have two retreats this year, one set up in Nashville that it's very Mary Magdalene focused. And I love how all these spiritual texts show up in our nervous system. So,
Mm.
help to tell us our stories. It's very much about being witnessed, because Mary Magdalene was the witness to Jesus's resurrection, and being witnessed is a huge part of healing.
Wow.
And also taking people to the south of France in September. So all of that is, um, it's happening. So yeah, but it's all on my website, so I won't
Super
detail it all
cool.
here. But if you want
Yeah.
to learn how to do this kind of stuff, and especially if you're a professional that works with other people, coach or healthcare professional, um, this is. Uh, but I think we also need to know, like, we tend to know more about our cars than we do about our bodies. I think we all get, like, we could all know how to do this at
Yeah.
some level, at our own capacity to heal ourselves and, and to really be able to heal each other. My husband would tell you that he's the reason, or that I'm the reason he's still walking upright.
Oh,
All of his
ah, what a world we would live in if we all knew.
Yeah. Yeah,
Even
right.
just
You
a
own this body. We all have a body. You get to know, you have a nervous system. You get to know how to use it.
wow. Wow. So last question, if you were standing on a stage right now and you just could talk to the entire world, send
Mm.
one message, what would that message be?
Oh, I would share my favorite Andean proverb.
Mm.
And I sometimes say this when have people do that helical breathing exercise that we did earlier. But I would let people know that your future is behind you, propelling you forward. Like your future has your back, and that your past is in front of you, waiting for you to make peace with it and clear your way. And I think that's the truest statement to how time works relative to our bodies. That your future is behind you, propelling you forward, and your past is in front of you, waiting for you to make peace with it and clear your way.
Wow, I love that. I didn't even give her that question ahead of time, and she was so prepared for it. I love that. That's actually funny because I've been having a lot of those thoughts lately that really align with that proverb. So thank you. Thank you for coming on. This was a fascinating conversation. This is really, really, really cool. Like very adjacent to what I do, obviously, but just in a completely different light and with so much different expertise and knowledge and science. So this was very, very fun chatting with you.
Well, thank you, Hannah. It's my karmic backstory in my astrology chart is lost voice. So I'm very grateful to have your platform to be able to share my voice and use it. That helps heal me.
Mm.
And yeah, like anybody can do this energy medicine. It is so like, you know, there's just so much potential and so much fun, like so many fun ways to heal. And I'm very grateful for you allowing me to babble on about it here because I
Yeah.
love it.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much.